Hello, everyone, and welcome to number 4 in a series, Poverty and Racial Justice. My name is Rashida Scar. I'm the branch manager for the Marin City Library. And today we are going to be talking about the human cost of poverty, and we're going to be discussing the ways in which poverty affects people's well-beings, individuals, families, communities, and our county as a whole. Um, we know that poverty can be a risk factor for several different ailments and illnesses, as well as mental health and social well-being. So we're going to be diving into that. Very briefly, I would like to introduce my co-hosts in this endeavor and our speaker for today. I'll start with the members of Surge. Um, First, we have Lisa Bennett. We have Barbara Kaler, we have Chelsea Supowit, and we are also joined by our speaker for the day, Jeremy Porgy, who is going to be sharing a little bit with us about his experiences. Um, Jeremy Porgy is I'm sorry, checking my notes here. He's a journalist and the owner and head of creative content at Mental Media LLC. And this is a video marketing agency that drives engagement for nonprofit organizations. He's got a lot of personal experiences too that I think really connect to our topic for today. So welcome. I'm glad that you are all here. So right now we're going to get started with, I wanted to mention a few items of housekeeping before we move on to the main portion of our program. Um, First of all, the next session in the series is the institutional toll of poverty on communities of color. That will be coming up within the next few months, so stay tuned. We don't have a date for that yet, but we will announce that when we get closer to that time. There are book lists for this program on the Marin County Free Library website, and we'll be posting that in the chat at the end of the program. And next, we're going to have Barbara come on and share a little bit about Surge Marin.
Yes, hi, I'm Barbara Kaler, and I'm here as a volunteer with Surge Marin. Welcome and thank you for showing up and being here today. Surge is the abbreviation for Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it's a national network of groups and individuals that started in 2009 to bring more white people into the racial justice movement. Surge has been in Marin since summer of 2017, when a small group of white people saw the need to join with local communities and leaders of color to work against the racial disparities in Marin County. We remain a 100% volunteer-led group, and we welcome people of all races and ethnicities to be in the collective work of challenging and dismantling white supremacy here in Marin in all its myriad forms: internal, external, systemic, structural, and interpersonal. We are partnered with 3 Marin-based community organizations that are led by people of color: the Marin City Arts and Culture, Marin County Cooperation Team, and the Multicultural Center of Marin. And a major portion of our net fundraising goes to these 3 partners. We also offer workshops and presentations, and a list of the past workshops that we've offered is on our website, if you're interested in knowing what that's about. And then if you want to take action, there's a action hour that takes place every Monday from 12 to 1 p.m. And also, if you want to take action anytime on your own, there's a section on our website called the Action News section, where you can go there and find out how to do that. So, and then there's another Marin County Free Library and Surge collaboration event happening, and that's also posted on our website, and it's in with the Stinson Beach Library coming up, and it's going to be a film discussion and a film showing and discussion on the film called Earth Mama. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.
You're
And,
welcome.
if you want any information about when that event is taking place, you can go to the Surge website. It will also be listed on the Marin County Free Library website under events. Okay, next we have Lisa, and Lisa's going to share our land acknowledgement. Lisa, I will leave that to you.
Great, thank you. Many of us are familiar with land acknowledgements, and for me personally, I feel like they can come across as very performative. And I found a wonderful video that kind of calls this out, and I would like that to be our land acknowledgement. So give me a second, I will share my screen and play for you what I would like to play. What I'd like to share is something about a local organization that we do support, which is the Indigenous Healing Center, which is officially launched in July 2021, emerged with the support of community members and organizations throughout Marin County in response to the needs of Indigenous families and communities, and working alongside the Native organizations already established in Marin. The Indigenous Healing Center is focusing on supporting Indigenous medicine practitioners and Indigenous health promoters and community health workers to offer health and healing services, education, and training, all from an Indigenous worldview. The Indigenous Healing Center's priority populations are Indigenous families, individuals, and communities in the County of Marin, including the large concentrations of Indigenous peoples from the South who come from diverse and intertribal cultures, including Central and Southern Mexico. You can donate at their webpage, which is indigenoushealingcenter.org, to support their work to access land and facilities to run programming, serve communities, as well as fulfill their center's purpose and vision. That's it from me.
We always try to add action items to our land acknowledgements because it's not enough to just say the land is stolen. We have to work to remediate that. So without further ado, I think we're going to start our films. The first film that we're going to be looking at to kind of introduce our topics is poverty in the U.S., the main reason for the removal of children from parents. And this is to kind of look at the ways in which poverty can affect the mental and physical well-being of families. Lisa, can you go ahead and share the screen for
Yes,
that?
hopefully I won't have technical difficulties again. We will see.
Offers one facet of what happens, what can happen for families who are dealing with poverty, is the extreme level of scrutiny and punishment that is levied against them. And I wanted to show this next video as kind of to fill in our view of, what that does for folks who are already dealing with so many stressful issues, mental health wise and health wise. So this next video is from it was a PBS documentary called Unnatural Causes. It's a little older, 2008. And this is from the first episode called In Sickness and in Wealth. And I'm going to share my screen. So in that video, we can see some of the physical and mental health things that happen for folks who are under high amounts of stress due to their income levels. And we have seen over the last years that income levels are very much tied to race and ethnicity because of institutional and structural racism. So, but it's as painful and as stressful as it is to kind of take a look at those snapshots, we are finding that these communities that are already so burdened are actually have a lot of the answers to the problem. And so that's going to be our next video. It's called "The Story We Tell About Poverty Isn't True," and it's a TED Talk. Lisa, can you share your screen for that?
Yes, I can.
Ooh, that's so powerful. Um, so those are our 3 videos, and I hope you got a sense of kind of maybe some of the issues that we're facing and possibly some solutions. But in that, we want to talk to somebody who is doing some of this work. So I would like to introduce Jeremy Porgy. Jeremy, just to tell you a little bit about Jeremy, I'm going to pull up a bio here for him. Sorry. Lots of things open right now. So he focuses on narratives of human triumph in the face of external challenges, particularly focusing on areas of mental health. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me start over again. Jeremy Porgy began sharing visual stories over 25 years ago when at the age of 16, a photo he made graced the front page of the local daily newspaper. Since then, his work has been published globally and has won numerous awards, international and national awards. Porgy's work focuses on narratives of human triumph in the face of external challenges, particularly focusing on the areas of mental health, homelessness, and poverty. Beyond professional pursuits, he is actively engaged in a life of community service. He's a member of the board of directors for NAMI Marin. He's a volunteer first responder for California's search and rescue team with his canine partner. And together they navigate the wilderness and urban settings to locate lost or missing individuals. He's the former chair of the City of Novato's Police Advisory and Review Board, and currently he is the chair of the Marin County's Human Rights Commission. Porgy's work has honed his ability to observe nuances and identify patterns in life to shed light on the unintended consequences of good policy and articulate these issues to a broad audience. Porgy is driven by a sense of duty to share these insights comprehensively, as well as emphasize the significance of fleeting moments. So welcome, Jeremy. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank
We'd
you.
love
Thank
to
you.
just dive in with questions. And I should add, if anybody has any thoughts, questions, ideas that you want to ask about, we will have a Q&A session at the end, but you can put your questions into the chat at any time and we will get to them and make sure that we set aside time to offer those questions up to Jeremy. So let's get started. First, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us a little bit about your background. How did you get here?
How did I get here? I think you just read a whole lot.
A lot.
It's very complicated, but how I got here, you know, I'll speak less about my experiences and qualifications. I'll speak more about my experiences. I mean, so I got here from being in that cycle that we were just learning about. I've always had a lens of human rights. Ever since I was a child, I was a human rights advocate. I was just born as an advocate for the essential rights of all beings. And through that, I have, like you said, focused on mental health, poverty, and homelessness, and specifically homelessness and poverty being pulled out separately because they're often intertwined and they're very different issues. Poverty, and what I'm hearing today, specifically through the racial lens, is a very, very interesting topic because if you look at Marin, it's an easy way using the phrase poverty and the poor. If you have to use the before it, it's otherizing, and it's a way for the rest of Marin can say, "No, not me. It's not my problem. I can drop off some food at a shelter or a tent and be done." But poverty is very different than that, and what we've learned is the physical effect. I think a few people refer to it as trauma, but that's exactly what I see it as from the foster care system. It's the trauma of the intrusion of the government. the watching eye, the critical eye. And it's my understanding, actually, there was 3 phases of foster care. It wasn't always called foster care, but back in the day, um, kids who didn't have parents were indentured servants. They just became indentured servants to those who had money, the wealthy. So another way for the wealthy to utilize the poor for commodity and more wealth. Look at slavery. The slaves were emancipated, but the fields still had to be picked. So a system was created for the school to prison pipeline, but also foster care. It was a way to ensure the next generation was already in the system to then pick up that work. And we look at it through an empathetic lens, but also look at it from the government utilizing people or the poor as a resource to make more wealth. And that's kind of how it's always been. And I think in I don't remember who said it, maybe it was the second video where they were talking about stress. And for me, poverty, I would replace the word poverty with living a life of survival. It's just, you're just surviving, whatever that means. And it could be financial, it could be otherwise, resource, whatever. But the effects of stress is cortisol, and they specifically said it increases glucose, blood pressure, and that's to respond. That's an adrenal response to fight. But if there's nothing to actively fight, but your life and your cycle in life, then that stuff is absorbed. And what are the number 2 diseases facing Black and brown Americans? Diabetes and high blood pressure. It's right there. It's the stress of survival. One of the things that wasn't really touched on is the financial cost of being poor. Just by not having enough money, it costs you more money to survive and exist. And I can get into details about that, but it's just astounding to me. And then to label and otherize and whatnot on top of that is a very interesting lens. And so as a journalist, I've been very interested in this topic and wanting to explore it much more. And I said, I talk about my experiences. I was homeless, and it started with being working poor, making just enough money to not quite get to the next paycheck. And the bills come in. And so which bill do you pay? You pay more of this one, part of this one, piece of this one, can't pay this one. Well, this one, and across the board, now adds fines, fees, and all sorts of additional more money to the bill, which now my next month bill is twice as much with fees, not like because of service, it's just fees. How do I come up with that? And so it's just a cycle that continues, and then you end up overdrawing your checking account. And then the bank, capitalism, bank comes in. Oh, we'll pay that, but for 16, 24, 38 bucks, 48 bucks. There was some legislation a few years ago that forced the banks to reduce these fees, but still they're charging 20 bucks a pop for overdraft fees. And if you utilize that too much, they cut you off, which is another bizarre thing because they're making 20 bucks per transaction. That's a very high interest loan. So once you're in that cycle, it's really like it's impossible to get out. So you have no money in the bank because it's already negative. So you get paid and you have less money to deal with and more bills, more fees, more fines just to be poor. So what do you do without a bank account? Because you can't pay bills really, and you can't do much without a piece of plastic and a credit card or whatnot. So you go with a prepaid card like NetSpend. When I did that, I think I had to pay like 20 bucks to get the card. And then every time I reloaded it, it was 9 something. So 10 bucks to reload the card. And then every transaction that I used on that card, they took a percentage, not a cost, just a percentage of or what was ever more to them. So either $10 or 10%. So if I'm paying now my phone bill, where it was my wife, myself, and my child, that's 3 lines, 30 bucks each. were turned off. To reactivate it, now I'm looking at a $30 fee for each line, so that my phone bill just doubled. So to pay that, now I have to pay a percentage to net spend, and it's just a cycle downward. And how do you get out of that? Well, they've created what they call entitlement programs. I hate that word, entitlement, right? But that's a trap within itself, because you can only make a certain amount of money as a family before you don't qualify. And that point at which you no longer qualify is still far below the cost of survival, especially in Marin County. So how do you get off of that? Right? How do you jump off of that cycle? It takes either a windfall or I don't know, you're just stuck and you're having to come up and generate this money. It's fascinating to me. I really want to know the true cost of being poor. I would argue that poor people spend much more money surviving day to day than those who don't have to worry about money. I just read a survey or a study that was published in a few things, and it explored the psychological effect of what they called SES, socioeconomic status. So there was low SES and high SES. And we can take any area, right? It's usually community kind of sticks together financially or socioeconomically. So within the low SES communities, there's often food deserts, job desert. There's no access to what one person in the video called choice, right? So you're stuck with what's there. People who are in low SES situation knowingly spend more money per product and less service to avoid the embarrassment of going into a high SES area to buy something because of the shame attached to having to buy smaller quantities, lower things, or less quality, but getting more. So we end up doing it to ourselves because of the shame attached to it. And this is like, it's a fascinating cycle, and how to get out of it. I love the response of investing, in the community itself. I mean, imagine how much power, influence the people in survival would have if banding together and no longer having to survive individually, but to survive as a whole, where we help ourselves. I read another thing in the New York Times that there was a study, I think it was last year, that said if they reduced cost of living for the low income or whatever cost of living by 1%, either housing or resources, just 1% would generate $6.5 billion in spending power in 1 year. That's money lost. That is the cost of being poor right there. So with that, I'll end my rant. I'll turn it over for questions and more exploration.
Yeah, no, and what you're describing there is this web, this maze of social structures and punishments that are levied against folks who are struggling with poverty, folks who are struggling with low income, folks who are struggling with homelessness, where they're even paying more to avoid the mental health load of shame and pain of and discomfort of moving outside of these really restrictive contexts. We heard in one of those videos where the guy was like, I don't leave my neighborhood, even though it's dangerous. I don't leave it because I know it's safer for me. So you're allowing this horrendous stress of having crime take place around you but that is a familiar stress that you know how to handle versus stepping outside of that community and possibly maybe dealing with suspicious neighbors. Why are you here? You don't belong here. We can tell just by looking at you that you don't belong here. The police possibly. So
It's
and then you're talking.
shame and then an additional level of survival.
Absolutely. So it's
Yeah,
like you're leveraging these really difficult uh stressors, and the same way you're like, okay, well, I, I can't afford to have a bank account, so I'm using this check cashing place, I'm paying more. So it's like you are leveraging these different, you're basically spending all your time robbing Peter to pay Paul,
absolutely,
constantly
absolutely.
moving
And
that move. Yeah, go ahead.
if you're if you're cashing checks, right now you have cash. Well, how do you pay your phone bill with cash?
Right.
You got to get a money order, and how much does a money order cost? So every step to utilize your dollar, you're penalized along the way. And then,
So
like this man who doesn't want to leave his neighborhood, I'm sure he's not thinking about when he goes to the store and buys Tide, right? For whatever, Tide is just the most popular laundry detergent, but in smaller quantities, it's like $7 a bottle, and you're paying, I don't know, $1 an ounce or something like that. But if you get a big jug, that's like $30. You're paying 50 cents an ounce. But I don't have that $30.
right.
I only have seven, right? And so this man who's not leaving also doesn't have those options. And so it just keeps perpetuating, and the cycle continues. And then he's talking about the psychological effect, but now add in the cortisol effect, right? Now blood pressure and glucose levels. And what does that do to your interaction and your state of mind? And now you're in an agitated, hungry state. And probably, if you leave your community, more likely to have the police called on you.
Right. Yeah, I think these are things that we're going to be touching on more with some of these other questions. Can you share a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing and how you're trying to highlight and bring out these stories? And what are some of the interesting solutions perhaps that you've stumbled across as you're engaging with organizations and communities that are trying to address some of these issues?
Yeah, that's a lot to unpack. I can tell you my solutions are to share the stories in an very easily digestible way so that people can hear them and no longer deny the existence of whatever we're talking about. Um, I just the other day, I think we have a participant on here that was with me. We went down to the bike path in Santa Fe, and I just couldn't. I went there just to be supportive of this person, and all of a sudden, a man is yelling at me, and he thought I was a caseworker. And so I used that as an opportunity to ask what he was upset about and why he didn't want to talk to a caseworker before I told him I'm a journalist and not a caseworker at all and interested in the story. And he told me to sit down and listen. So I ended up leaving with this story. And one of the questions was about choice and why wouldn't you go to a shelter? Or why wouldn't you go X, Y, and Z? And some of his answers surprised me. It was beyond the food sucks. Of course, he mentioned because you don't have the same food choices,
Right.
but also safety. One of leaving his belongings on the street unwatched, right? His valuables, but two, who you may run into, right? You're forcing a community to coexist with so much stress, and it's not a choice. It's not a neighbor or a community of choice in that regard, right? They're forced to live near each other, and so of course you have upsets and whatnot. So worry about your neighbor. And that was very surprising to me. In terms of solutions, I've not heard many, and I don't know of many because it's systemic. I mean, we're talking about a system of just even capitalism. All these steps along the way that charge a percentage that's capitalism. And so how do you change that? Right? I don't think you can. They tried, they lowered the amount of fees, but it's still restrictive to get out of this cycle. So there's the best solution I heard was in that TED talk about community. And I see that in other areas and stories I work on, that community tends to take care of self when allowed to. When a community is allowed to exist and display its own culture and own individuality, it tends to then take care of itself. So
I love that.
right. But I think also there's a division within what we're talking about in poverty for the Black and brown and whatnot, and then poverty just in general, not being able to make it. And my lens has been both. I just have the perspective of both perspectives, and so it's so much more complicated than we think.
Especially when we're trying to source solutions from the same system that is causing the problems, right? So what is the CPS,
Right.
solution for a system that is literally built? I mean, if somebody calls, this woman's child is in dirty clothes, this person's child is in dirty clothes, CPS is now involved. How do you have a solution with that? It's
Right.
like some of the same institutions that are causing these stressors, that are causing these issues or exacerbating the issues. We're asking those same institutions to solve the problem,
Right.
and
And they're even defining measures of which, at what point you're poor and take your kids away. So we're talking dirty clothes, no food in the kitchen. These are all evidences of surviving. Right. So if you're in true survival mode and have kids, now they're looking at taking your kids away. And so now you have to survive and then fight to get your kids back, and what happens to your children. Right. I know of a woman who was in foster care and she was doing well, and they would not let a family adopt her because she was Black and the family was white. They didn't think the family would be able to give this child the true experience that they deserve as a Black individual. What does that mean? What are we saying if we won't allow a wealthy family to adopt a Black child because they won't give them the same experience of a Black American? Well, then is Black America supposed to have this survival experience? Is that really what we're saying? I don't know.
hard. That is like that's a real head scratcher. So we're looking at like these very complicated problems, and we're trying to use these same systems to try to find solutions, but they're not equipped. They're equipped to keep the status quo.
That's what
And
they're
we're looking
designed
for
for.
change.
They're absolutely designed with intention. And so if we're just trying to change like the method of this organization doing its purpose, that's one thing. But if we're talking about changing the purpose, then we have to be talking about changing or ridding the organization. But it's not just that, because one of the studies that I read, I can post a link in the chat later, also said in this socioeconomic choice of staying within and paying higher prices, some of the stores, they didn't experiment by doing almost an acknowledgement, right? It's the all lives matter approach from the business, right? We support all. It's their equity statement. It is their forward image of supporting other communities. Actually makes it harder for low income families to shop there, because now they're all defined as this, that, and the other, or they're automatically assumed to be that, all of which this organization fights. So it does even more harm.
Right. The shame that is leveraged against folks who are surviving. And I have to add, we shame folks for being in survival mode, but they are incredibly high functioning. Why? Because they have to think 15 different thoughts. They have to solve 15 different problems just to do day-to-day stuff that we take for granted, if we have a more steady income. So they have they're constantly found solutions and problems that we're still scratching our heads about because they have to do that so much.
Right,
Their
right.
thought process is incredibly complex, and it is exhausting, and it takes a physical and mental toll. But that is almost why they have so many more tools for
Yes.
answers to some of these problems. Like you ask, somebody who's poor what the government could do to better assist them, they'll be able to tell you. They'll be able to give you, like, here's a list of 5 things that the government could do right now that would make my life easier. But also often we don't listen to people who are in those situations.
Sure. And even if we do, it's the government.
Right.
The government itself can't change. It just can't change. We can keep adding parts to rectify, like I say, the unintended consequence of good policy. But the government itself is the system of which we all live and operate. So how can that change? So we have Reimagine, and so I love that. But the problem is safety and people's lack of letting go of one to try a new that's being tried. And we forget this is all a great big experiment. So why aren't we examining other completely different options, right? We live in Marin County, or this is based in Marin County, and that's one of the wealthiest, most innovative areas in the country. Why do we not have a solution? I think we've tried with I forget the name of the program, but the government was giving $1,000 to single moms in the Black community. I think Marin adopted that, and that's done wonders. That shows the impact of lowering cost of living by just 1%, right? So that could be something. I mean, but that's capitalism. How do you fight that? How do you ask corporate America to lower everything by 1%?
Tell me more about the unintended consequences of good
Mm,
policy. I love that phrase, and I feel like there is something about what's behind that phrase that is contributing to and exacerbating some of these issues. Tell me more.
yeah. Well, everything we're talking about today. I mean, the entitlement programs, foster care systems, these are all policies that on forward facing are designed to help. We when we're talking about foster care, we don't tell stories like we heard today. We hear the horror stories. My mom worked social work in the emergency room in New York City doing CPS, like social work stuff. So she wasn't actively taking children away, but she had to assess based off of the child's injuries. Um, those are all great and needed for the macro and the happening now, but systemically, it was designed to take children away and put them in a cycle, whether it be lower education, which then access to education is huge, right? I mean, that's an issue in and of itself here in Marin County. The difference in standards across the county itself within districts, or even schools. So lower education leads to what? Either burnout, lower access to jobs, lower access to higher education. And then now what? Now you're here with no paper that you didn't pay for to get a high paying job, where this guy says he's now fortunate to make all these choices. Now you're stuck in survival. You're just stuck there because of the system. So solutions to me are only in the here and now, unless we're willing to examine something that we've not ever seen yet.
Absolutely.
So I don't really know how to answer that question. And like, what can you do now?
All right. I don't
Other
think
than
there's
be aware, being aware
right.
of it. That's a huge part.
We're not going to come up with any easy answers for this, but
Nope.
I do feel like we're starting to look at some of these, if not solutions, at least, first steps,
Mhm.
and I think listening to people of color marginalized communities that are constantly having to navigate these systems, what's going wrong? Like they have a lot of those answers. And so from the standpoint of your work with mental media, what do you see as the role of storytelling and humanizing and healing communities impacted by poverty?
Well, you just said it in your question. So the
Tell
goal
me
of mental
more.
media is to it's twofold, right? So it's designed, it's rooted in storytelling and the belief that community storytelling and hyper local news is where it's at, because that's what impacts your life the most. We like to focus on large government. The presidential candidates take up a lot of time, but in actuality, what they do doesn't impact your life until years later. What impacts your daily life is local, hyper local. It's local politics, it's all of that, networking. But people in the community don't have access to that really. So the local government, I mean, you show up to a city council meeting, you get 3 minutes to tell them about something. You can't learn anything in 3 minutes by just a stranger just randomly telling you something. So storytelling, it's rooted in teaching people who don't have access to that education or the equipment or how to effectively share what's happening to them. So teaching them the basics of visual storytelling, whether that be using your iPhone or a camera or whatnot, the basics of video, video and photography and what's important to tell a story, in the hopes that they go out and start telling the stories that are important to them, that they see within their communities. And I don't like to use they, there, but in terms of individuals, because it's otherizing as well. But it's we all are telling stories that are important to us. And when those are broadcast, you can't help but ignore it, right? We can parse off into the effects of law enforcement on the Black community, right? How long have we been saying that the police are violent, the police are harmful, they don't make us feel safe? How long have we been saying that there's abuse and whatnot? And not until recently when there's video, right? And then there's still other eyes. Oh, that's Minnesota, that's not here, right? And then, so fortunately, people recorded my incident and, Mateo went through hell. But you're no longer afforded the privilege of saying not here. And so storytelling does that. That's the importance, and that's the goal.
Tell us about this incident, and let's talk about the ways that class and race played into that. Some folks might not be aware of what you went through with that. Can you share?
I can share a little. I'm still going through it. I was attacked by an officer and arrested in Sausalito while documenting. I was working on the documentary on homelessness, and not much I can say about the officer, but he no longer works for the department. Several officers, including the chief, were resigned. But this officer, in attacking me, was attacking the First Amendment as I was telling the stories and giving voices to the homeless people that the city was forcing to live in a feces contaminated field. So what they did was silence them. Fortunately, through my personal network, I sought representation and am able to fight back. But I know what happened to me so I was attacked and then they arrested me and charged me. The police department wrote charges of battery, resisting arrest. And there was a second felony, but it was repetitive. It was like resisting arrest felony, resisting arrest misdemeanor. The DA didn't even accept the charges. So charges weren't dropped. They just were never brought because she looked at the video and said, nah. How many other people, though, without the resources and the networking that I fortunately had, are stuck in this system? that's,
Right.
it's mind blowing to me. And so we can talk about, sure, I didn't have money. I'm still in survival mode, but people banded together for me. And now I have access to this higher quality, you want to say, I don't know, right? More, a better lawyer than someone with less money, a better lawyer than would charge less, so to speak, right? But there's the cost right there. If I were poor, I would not have that, and I would be in the system. I'd probably be in jail right now, which is insane to me. So, right? So that's what
And
happened to me. And so through that, I've been looking through a different lens of the criminal system and the racial disparity here in Marin.
it's just, there's two things that occur to me as I'm listening to you speak. The first is, it comes down to the choices that they were talking about in the second video. Uh, as far as storytelling, it gives power back to those who have been powerless. I get to decide my story. I get to write the narrative. I get to share what I want to share. And so it's offering that a little bit of choice, a little bit of power back to those who are so often the victims of the narrative that is imposed upon them.
Exactly. So they no longer have to prove the existence of what they're fighting, which has been my fight so long when I'm talking about the racist underbelly of Marin. We like to present ourselves as a whole, if we're speaking of Marin, as a very liberal county and accepting, and we're not racist because I don't use the N-word, but it's a white supremacist county. And if we parse out racism from white supremacy, then you'll be able to see how Marin operates with the idea of better than. We'll include, but we're better than. There's always otherizing. So
Yeah.
storytelling removes the onus on the storyteller or the impacted person to prove the existence of whatever it is that's impacting their life.
They can just show. And that is,
Exactly.
there's something so powerful about that, being able to just hold up that mirror, hold up that lens and say, look at this, holding up that picture. And it's your picture, it's your reality, and you're sharing that.
Mhm.
That's the first thing I see. And then the second thing is kind of what we were talking about from the third video, is because you had a community of people who came around you and were able to help you navigate the system, you were able to get a lawyer that kept you out of the prison. And we've had other conversations in the past about how the criminal justice system impacts people and, basically puts people in debtor's prison when you can't pay bail.
Yeah.
You're
So I
innocent
would
till
remove the
proven
word
guilty.
justice. The
The
criminal system.
criminal system. And
Yeah.
right. So you have like that, because you had a community that was able to come around you and support you, you were able to better navigate. It gave you more choice. You weren't
Yes.
stuck with, an overworked public defender who has 300 cases and you're 301.
Right.
You were able to, hire a lawyer that was able to actually had the time and the space to advocate for you well. So,
Absolutely. And that was the criminal part of it. But
right.
let's not forget the psychological effect of this. So for me, being attacked by a police officer in the parking lot of a homeless encampment, as extreme as it may sound, very much feels to me as being publicly whipped as a slave to prove a point, to silence those watching. This is happening to the person that's going to amplify your voice. What do you think is going to happen to you? And so
Mm.
moving forward, since then, flash forward 2 years, I'm still dealing with the traumatic effect of a police officer who I've always been taught is a hero that protects you and saves the day, attacking me, thinking I'm a bad guy. Wait, I'm not a robber. It's cops and robbers. I'm not a robber. What are you doing?
Right.
So now I'm dealing with the traumatic and psychological effects years later. So it's so intertwined because now the PTSD, the fight or flight, the cortisol, the decision to leave your house. Do I want to go to Target 10 miles away for a cheaper price. No, I'm going to the corner store where I'm paying $3 more. So I can just go home. Right. So it just
Right.
perpetuates.
Just so you can have that sense of safety and peace of mind. Oh,
Yeah.
I feel like we're touching on a lot of these issues. As you're interviewing folks who are homeless and
Mhm.
other folks who might be dealing with, who are on the margins, or what are some of the stories or the experiences that you think really tell the story of what happens internally to people, what happens in their families, what
Mm.
happens in their communities when they are dealing with homelessness?
Um, it's hard to answer because everyone has a different story, and that's kind of the point. But some of the similarities and threads are shame, um,
Mm,
survival just for existence, and I can't go here to earn money because my stuff is here, and someone's going to steal all of my things, and then it's just a cycle. It's public harm. People are actually physically assaulting and
yeah.
trying to harm the homeless. Um, so the commonality is the shame and being seen. I hear a lot of different phrasings, but it boils down to bearing witness. And I'm a human being suffering and um in different ways. Everyone has their own different ways, but it boils down to that. And how do we see and hold them? And it's different for everybody, I think. And so you just have to, like I'm trying, you have to listen to the individual story and be empathetic and know that we're all humans. And if one is suffering, we're all suffering.
Absolutely. One thing that struck me as we were watching the videos is just the ripple effect of you have an individual that comes up against the system. It's traumatizing. They're having to survive. They're having to do XYZ more than somebody making more money than them to survive. And then that's affecting their kids.
Mm.
So, I'm stressed out. I'm trying to pay these bills, not quite doing it. How are my kids getting stressed out? Okay, now I'm not able to pay bills. The lights are off. Somebody's calling CPS because my kid wasn't able, uh, like, okay, so now I'm having to deal with CPS. My kid's in the system. Like, so you see, it starts with the individual impacting a system that is kind of designed to do them harm.
Very much
That
so.
ripples out to their families.
Mhm.
And then you have whole communities of families that are dealing with the ripple effect of that. And
Who are very shameful and not talking about it to the other members of their communities who could equally support and band together. I think what we're seeing is if we call it poverty and you itemize what is poverty, A, B, C, D, what are the things that are affecting someone who is in this mode? Each one of those things have become criminalized. Each one of those things you have to worry about CPS. You have to worry about how do you come up with the money, right? It's each one is now criminalized, and I very much feel it's a system by design, and how you change it is like we're talking about creating a boundary around that system by banding together as a community and being open and vulnerable and removing the shame and the lack of credibility because of these instances that have happened to you because you are poor or surviving.
I think sharing the stories of marginalized folks is going to be such an important factor as we move into, we're kind of seeing like the culture wars, right? So we're
Mm.
kind of seeing who gets to tell the stories, what books are allowed to stay in, which authors are getting published. So from a library perspective, that's what we're seeing. But that has ripples outward as well. Like there is a very real battle being fought about whose story gets to be told, who is silenced, and that's impacting public policy. Because if the stories are only one kind of story and other stories are being suppressed, then how can you make a good decision about what works best for those who are most impacted by a racially unjust system? How are
Yes.
you a system that's geared to keep them in the places where the system has placed them?
Well,
Um,
information is power.
it
And
is.
I have, to be honest, and shocking, I will not name names, but I have had conversations with people who have been in deciding role and have asked them, how the heck can you have decided or voted for X, Y, and Z when this is so painfully obvious? But in this, I refer to as the unintended consequence of the policy they just put forward. And to my dismay, there is a lack of knowledge within this power circle of what's really happening because they're not in it. They don't have to deal with it. And you can't really communicate it during your 3-minute public comment. And it takes grassroots efforts to amplify the issues, but that can only take you so far. The stories, the faces of those impacted, telling you how they are impacted is really, really where it's at. But then what? Then what? And it's my hope that the way I tell a story is to bring up an idea that maybe you think you already know, offer it in such a way that you relate, but then are like, whoa, there's a whole nother perspective to that. It's both. And being aware of that, you now change a little.
I'm going to ask this last question and then we'll open it up for public questions for a Q&A. But what is one thing that you would like policymakers and voters and people who are going to be making decisions about the fate? And again, we're still talking about, somebody else making decisions that affect people who are dealing with poverty and racialized injustice. But what is something you want people to know? What is something that you want people to know as they're making these decisions, as they're creating policy, as voters are voting on these bills that have deep bit about that?
That's another hard statement because it's not blanket. Each issue has I wish you would know. And so what I would ask of our leaders is to incorporate in their decision-making process either roundtable or cabinet members who are completely opposite minded of them. They're not aligned. Bring more people to the table with different perspectives, and then you get around a completely knowledgeable understanding of an issue. What we do all too often is bring stakeholders to the table, and they all have the same intention, the same mindset, and the same perspective, and that's just what pushes forward. But if you have people you don't agree with, then you have a discussion, and then you root out really the core issues and address those, and the rest and the visuals and the optics then all fall into place, I believe.
So your thought is we need to widen the table and make sure that everyone who is affected, whether we believe their perspective, whether we accept their perspective or not, we need to have them have a voice at the table.
Everybody has a voice and opinion, and everybody has a story, so to speak, right? And even those who this group would consider completely out there and out of their mind have something in a core in them that they're trying to protect. And if we can get rid of all the other stuff and address that core, I bet you 7 out of 10 times it's the same thing. And we can come up with a similar issue. It's the otherizing. It's the, I don't want to be that. I don't want to look at that. And so we tear down people in survival mode. We criminalize them. So it's easier to separate. So I would say in policy, right, if we're talking about policy and creating it, you need more opinions and voices at the table, whether you agree with them or not.
I'm loving everything you're saying. Oh, let's open this up. If there are questions from the audience, I also have, you know, a couple of questions that I can ask as well. But if there are thoughts,
Mm.
opinions, please pop them into the chat. We'd be happy to field those and put those out there. I know that we're, you know, while we're waiting for people to populate that, let's talk about the intersection of mental health, racial trauma, and poverty. So
Ooh.
how do you see those as being intertwined, and how do those come up as we're, you know, what do you think is the best format for that intersection to come to light for our decision makers, you know, the folks who are creating these policies?
It's a hard question. I think each one of those issues have their own issues, fights, and internal fighting. I think we need to come to a common understanding of each one of those before we can discuss a way to attack it. I think just the last three videos you showed show how you go from not being able to make enough money to then what happens physically and psychologically, and then what do you do individually with that, whether you form a community to fight and get out of it. But think about what that takes from a person's standpoint to be surviving all of this and then put themselves out there and find others and then fight on top of the survival. You're asking so much. And I bless those, and I'm grateful for those who do that put themselves out there and are willing to tell their story in hopes of change.
And I think too, it shows how much community can ameliorate some of that personal load. So communal storytelling.
Mhm.
So it's not just my story, it's the story of my community. So, you know,
That's the
we're
hope.
talking, yeah, where that community story is being put before policymakers. And so it's not just my voice. I'm not fighting alone. This is our voice. This is our story. We're presenting it to you. Now, how are you going to address the concerns brought up in our story? You know, so I
Mhm.
really appreciate the work that you're doing with these communities, with nonprofits that are working with communities who are in this struggle for choice,
Mm.
the struggle for being able to control their destinies. I think that that is so powerful as we head into an election year that is so fraught. It already feels so fraught.
Mm.
Um,
Thank you.
it,
Yeah.
it looks like we have a question coming up in the chat here. I'm gonna throw that out that. We're seeing the recession of support for DEI efforts now that the horror of what happened to George Floyd is a few years behind us. Did DEI efforts fail, or did the system reassert itself and take them down? What is your viewpoint on that?
I think um, we have to take a step back and look at time. I think we have to analyze what time is. If we look at from when the country started to when we signed the Declaration of Independence, there was a lot of time we don't even explore. And then 1776 to 1960, right? We talk about the amendments added. I think we need to, um, it's hard to say this, but we need to relax on the time frame. If you look at Marin County and the Office of Equity and the $2 million that was supposedly taken from the sheriff, um, they just announced just this last week what they're going to do with that. And this was how many years later. But what they're going to do with that is some amazing work and things that would never have happened if not for DEI. I think DEI was a very catchy phrase and easy to onboard organization. The work is equity, really, I think. Um, and equity, like I'm saying, we're fighting a system that exists to continue to colonize, and we're trying to stop that. And that's going to take a lot of time.
Absolutely. And I would say the that's what we've seen throughout history. You talked about taking the historical view, is that whenever you have these groundswells of progress and push, so that's like kind of these big pushes that are happening towards change, you have the backlash. So when we're, we can take comfort in the fact that, DEI wasn't for nothing. Like that movement is
It
still
still
happening.
exists. It still
It's
exists.
still
It's just
happening.
not being, it's not just not catchy anymore.
And we're
Restorative
just
justice is now catchy. But if not for the DEI work, restorative justice probably wouldn't be here or as
absolutely.
prevalent. So think of it as incremental,
That's exactly it.
right? So there's someone on the call, right? An advocate, a longtime advocate and agitator. She was on the police advisory review board with me. And one day on a walk, she was upset about, look, we've been fighting for how many years and what's changed? What's changed? And I said to her, well, one of the things that she brought up was the complaint process, the citizen complaint process for the Novato Police Department. And it was done completely online. You had a online form with 1,000 characters, and that was it. Truth be told, you had a lot more. You could turn it in with a lot more information, and you could appeal it, but there was no mention of that. So the family who lost their dog to that incident in Petaluma, they had no recourse. They didn't know they could appeal it. Well, this person on the call brought this up during a meeting, and we noticed maybe a few weeks later, the wording on the site was different. The character limit was removed, and there was mention of appeal. That's change. That happened because this person brought it up. It's not huge. There was no meeting. There was no press conference to announce the change. And I think we have to change our expectation of that. The government is never going to say, we messed up. This is so wrong. Let's fix this on their own, unless there's a lawsuit. What they will do is secretly pretend it was never happening, change it, and say, look, it was never happening. But we know it changed. So we have to keep that in mind, and we have to keep the incremental changes and celebrate those as a whole, because then, like the Barbie movie says, when we stop, we can now see how far we've actually come.
I think that is incredible. And I think that too, that helps restore a sense of control, and for people that having that, seeing your story make an impact, even in a small way, because you have to think this is a behemoth of a system. And even that small change is so huge for the next person that's coming up, the person coming up behind you. This is incredibly powerful stuff. I appreciate you so much, Jeremy. Thank you
Thank
so much
you.
for taking time with us today.
Yeah.
We
Thanks
popped a
for the
few.
invite.
We are just so thrilled to be able to have these conversations. I want to give a special thanks to the Friends of the Marin City Library who helped make this event possible. Marin County Free Library, the members and supporters of Surge Marin, and of course, Jeremy, our guest. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us. I think these conversations, as we have them, we offer, like you said, information is powerful. Offering this information, offering these perspectives, these snapshots, inform us as voters. It informs our policymakers, and it makes a real difference, even in a small way. I think as we continue to have these conversations, we're going to start seeing changes over the long game. So we appreciate you guys so much. I popped some links in the chat. Please feel free to check them out if you want to learn more about Surge Marin. Check out our book list. We have some really powerful things on there if you want to continue learning about these topics. Check out the Indigenous Healing Center. They're an amazing organization. They're doing a lot of good work with Indigenous communities in Marin. And check out Jeremy's work. I know you'll be seeing more, we'll be hearing more from him. Follow him around, catch up on what he's up to as time goes by. I think we're going to be seeing some really cool stories coming from his corner of the universe. So we appreciate him. And thank you all for joining us. This is such a powerful event, and we appreciate each and every one of you so much. Thank you and take care. You guys have a great afternoon.